Welcome to the Plant Cunning Podcast,
where we explore a relationship to plants, other people, and the mysteries of nature.
Coming to you from the high Allegheny Plateau in central New York.
We are your hosts, A.C. Staubel
and Isaac Hill.
Episode 58, Landrace Gardening with Joseph Lofthouse. Joseph Lofthouse, author, gardener, farmer, is today's guest on the Plant Cunning Podcast. He's such an interesting person to talk to, and Isaac and I had a great time getting to know him today. Joseph comes from a long line of farmers and growers, and he even tells a great story about his great-great-grandfather who selected a very special seed. So definitely take a listen to hear more about that. I just love learning about Joseph's outlook as a grower. What some farmers may call weeds and pests, Joseph sees as companions and allies in his gardening. He makes contracts with the local bugs and simply adores the self-regenerating cover crops that naturally grow as weeds in his garden. If you're a grower, a farmer, homesteader, gardener of any kind, seed saver, you're going to absolutely love this episode. We dive into promiscuous pollination, which is encouraging the survival of the fittest in the garden, essentially. What landrace gardening actually is and how it compares to something like gardening with heirlooms. And we cover how important community is, not just in landrace gardening specifically, but also in just our survival and food security, and how creating really resilient local varieties of plants that can adapt to not only our local seasons and drought or fire conditions or whatever it may be, but can adapt to a changing climate. And so we really dive deep in this episode. There's lots of examples of different plants that he's grown with success, like carrots for clay and rocky soil, as well as stories and anecdotes from Joseph. I really liked hearing about his philosophy, both for the garden and for life, and I know you're going to love this episode too. As always, thank you so much to all of our supporters over at Patreon. If you'd like to check out the different tiers that we have to offer at Patreon, starting at the $4 a month level, you can go to patreon.com/plantcunning. One of the member benefits for patrons at the $9 level is you'll have access to episodes that are only available on patreon.com. So this episode is actually one of those where we've split it into two. The first 45 minutes is available here to you now for free. And then if you'd like to access the second half of the conversation, you can go to patreon.com/plantcunning and sign up for this month at $9. As some of our listeners may know, I'm a community herbalist and I make some herbal products like skin soothing salve and muscle rubs and bath salts and room and body and mask sprays under the name Traveling Herb Farmer. I have some gift kits on my website that include a salve and a tincture and a lip balm with different themes like a lung and respiratory immune support blend, a stress relief self-care lavender love blend, and a woodland blend. So all the herbs that I use are either grown here at our homestead in central New York or harvested from a nearby place with a lot of care and reverence, and I use all organic ingredients. So check it out. See if there's anything that catches your eye for you or yours. My website is www.travelingherbfarmer.com. That's travelingherbfarmer.com. As a listener of Plant Cunning, I'd love to offer you free shipping on up to 5 orders for the whole month of December. So at checkout, just enter the promo code PlantCunning21. Capital P, capital C, Plant Cunning 21 for free shipping. And without further ado, we bring you Joseph Lofthouse. How are you doing today, Joseph?
I'm doing good, AC. Thanks for asking.
Awesome. We are just super excited to talk to you. Ever since we got your book in Landrace Gardening, we've just been talking about these ideas that you've presented to us. And, we just can tell from reading this that you're a super cool person. So we're just really stoked to chat with you. We have a traditional first question on the Plant Cunning podcast.
Yeah. So what brought you to the plant path?
So I probably didn't know that there was any other path because my family, for as long as anybody can remember, have been farmers, and so it just seems natural for me to continue that tradition.
Cool.
So where did you grow up? Where was you and your family from?
So my family grew up in the mountains of northern Utah.
Cool.
We're in a little valley, so the cold air pours down out of the mountains all summer and all winter,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of affects what things I can grow and how I can grow them.
So what is your what was your USDA zone?
So we're in a USDA zone 4 or 5. I have a couple of different fields and they're at different elevations, so the zone varies between fields. But in that ballpark, I have about 100-day growing season. Sometimes it can be as short as 85 days or as long as 110.
Mm-hmm.
But I can only grow a 70-day tomato just because it's so cold that they don't really have enough warmth to develop in here. My fields are irrigated, and in the 20 years I've been farming, we only had one season where there wasn't sufficient irrigation water, and so that's a blessing to me as a farmer.
Oh yeah.
But the climate is generally pretty dry compared to where we are out east.
Yeah, so relative humidity sometimes will be 5% in an evening, and I might not have dew in my garden the whole growing season.
Wow.
So for me, dew is an unusual celebration, something that's so weird that you have to just feel uneasy about it.
Yeah, I see. We're kind of opposite there. We're a similar climate zone. We're maybe a little bit warmer than you, but we have so much. It's 90% humidity most of the time.
Yeah, the dew will be on the grass until noon sometimes.
Right.
Crazy.
But yeah, you've got some pretty specific challenges and obstacles with your climate zone, and that brings in why landrace gardening is so important. But we can talk about that a little bit later. But it'd be interesting to talk about your family a little bit, because in the book you mentioned that your great grandfather introduced a strain of grain into the area that is still grown.
So my great grandfather in about 1880 was growing grains, and the USDA at that time used to collect seeds and send them to farmers just so that they could try. And there was one seed in that packet of seeds he got that grew better than all of the rest of the wheat in his field, better than anything he'd ever saw before. And so he took that one plant and grew it out in his family garden. And eventually it went on to become the most widely planted wheat in southern Idaho and northern Utah.
Wow. That's so cool.
Yeah. And that was just because he was paying attention that there was something different in his field, something that really liked growing here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And not everything likes growing in your climate.
Oh, no. I received about 2,000 varieties of wheat that I planted in my field here, and less than only 5% of them actually did very well for me, just to show you how tough it is for a crop that you'd think would grow anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So are you like a market gardener? Do you grow for farmers markets and restaurants and things like that, vegetables and grains and things?
So I originally started farming 12 years ago as a market gardener.
Uh-huh.
And I was selling for restaurants and I was running a CSA. But along the way, I figured out that there was $20 worth of seeds in a $2 cantaloupe.
Oh.
Yeah.
And so I transitioned to growing more seeds,
Mm.
and that was easier on me. I used to farm up to 4 acres just
Mm.
myself and my manual labor and a
Just
tractor
yourself?
once in a while. Yeah,
Oh
and
my goodness.
that was too much. I couldn't do it well.
Yeah. 4 acres
So
is a lot.
so now I'm currently farming 3/4 of an acre,
Uh-huh.
and I'm a I call myself a vacant lot farmer,
Nice.
and in other words, land is a burden to its owners, and if they can find someone that will take care of it for them, they
Yeah.
think that's really cool, and so do I.
Yeah.
And so at one time I was just saying yes to anybody that said they wanted me to farm their land, and now I'm being more discerning and just sticking with one
Mhm.
garden plot. Well, and a couple of little sidewalk gardens, because I like to have, as much as I say that I like cross pollination, once in a while I don't want cross pollination. And
Mhm.
so I have a couple little backyard gardens that people let me use as well.
Cool.
So what do your gardens look like? What's your like garden
Yeah.
philosophy? Are they messy? Are they very orderly?
So my gardens are weedy
Cool.
Nice.
because I think of the weeds as a self-regenerating multi-species cover crop.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I take those weeds and I turn them right back into the soil right where they grew, and that provides my soil fertility for next year.
Uh-huh.
And also, as a plant breeder, I want to be selecting for plants that can outcompete the weeds. And
Yeah.
so weeds are a blessing to my garden, because then they select which plants can really thrive here. Um,
Mm.
I always used to lose my, when I was a market gardener, I always used to lose my carrots to the weeds because the carrots were so slow to germinate and they grew so slowly. And so for 2 or 3 years in a row, I let the carrots grow without weeding and just replanted whatever meager little plants I managed to harvest.
Uh-huh.
Replanting mean to get seeds from them the second year.
Cool.
And so these days, my carrots can outcompete the weeds. They grow these huge plants that are like 2 feet tall.
What?
Just, and the carrots will be 3 pounds each. Just these
Wow.
huge monster carrots. So my garden is very weedy.
That's so inspiring. Yeah, carrots are really tricky, especially we have such rocky soil, and I had to like baby this tiny little 4 by 4 foot patch of bed for my carrots to just get
Right.
some. So now I'm totally going to do that and replant some of them to get the seeds for next year and try to get them to do well for us here.
Well, see, another thing that I ended up selecting for in carrots is I ended up selecting for carrots that are more beet shaped.
Oh,
Ooh.
Because
Yeah.
then, because my soil is really heavy clay, and so in the fall, digging carrots was just problematic. But if I select for like wedge shaped
Yeah.
carrots that are shorter and not so long, then they're much easier to deal with.
Cool. That's another good tip.
so how did you get started selecting seeds? Was it because like the varieties from the seed companies weren't working well for you, or because of challenges like you just mentioned? Like, how did that process start?
It had nothing to do with any of that. It was all about art,
Oh,
Nice.
because I was a market farmer and I wanted some sweet corn that had some color in it. And none of the commercial sources of sweet corn had color in them. And I'm like, wah, wah, wah. And so there was this farmer back in Indiana, Alan Bishop, and he had taken 200 varieties of sweet corn, everything he could find from anywhere, and grew them together in a field and let them cross pollinate.
Mhm.
And he ended up with sweet corn that had speckles of color all over in it, and some of the cobs were fully like orange or red or gray. And so I planted it originally for decoration.
Nice. Okay.
But then when I saw how that crop grew, it was really lovely because some plants were short and they just plain old died, and some of the seed died before it germinated. But some of it grew and it was robust, and it was more reliable for me than the commercial sweet corn that I'd been growing. And I just fell in love with the idea of allowing promiscuous pollination and then saving seeds from what was survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
And so once I understood that idea, then I started changing everything I grew to that sort of growing conditions.
Yeah. That's
Wow.
really,
Yeah.
really cool. So yeah, starting from, just wanting to appreciate some color and,
Beauty. Yeah.
beauty, you really like reframed how you think about growing and the plant world in general, it seems like.
Right. And along the way, I stopped thinking about diseases and pests as my enemies.
Yeah.
And I started thinking of them as my friends and my companions. And they teach the plants how to grow. They teach me what plants are their survivors and that aren't bothered by the pests and the diseases.
Yeah. That's amazing. And it brings to my mind a story that you have in your book, which to me, like, I think this is a really an animist perspective. And I think a lot of like animism is kind of a buzzword these days. A lot of people are a little academic with it, but what you're doing is like actually relating to all of these beings as people that you have actual relationships
Yeah,
with.
the weeds and the insects and the plants that you're growing, yourself.
But so you have like contracts with your potato beetles, right?
Yeah, so the contract with the potato beetles goes something like this. I'm not going to harm the potato beetles in any way as long as they don't eat the potatoes.
Right.
And they have a natural, or there's a weed in my garden that is the natural host for the potato beetles. They'd rather eat that than my potatoes anyway. And so I never harm a potato beetle as long as it's eating the weed. And if my potatoes, if I have a variety of potato that starts attracting the beetles, I kill that variety of potato because I don't want to confuse the terms of the contract.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I'm sort of breeding the beetles or modifying the culture of the beetles, however that works, so that they can exist in peace and harmony in my garden.
I think that's brilliant.
Yeah. Beautiful.
See, I can't do that kind of contract with, say, the cabbage white moths that blow in on the wind.
Right.
But still, I don't harm them in any way. Like I grow red cabbages, for example, because the green caterpillars show up in sharp contrast on the red cabbage leaves, and then the predators can eat them.
Oh, cool.
And so it works out all right.
Very smart.
And like those tomato hornworms that go and decimate a tomato, those turn into hummingbird moths. And the hummingbird moths are so precious to me because of my childhood memories watching them in my grandmother's bleeding heart flowers and her petunias.
Yeah.
And I grow like 300 tomato plants. I don't care if the moths eat some of them, whatever.
Yeah. Hummingbird moths are gorgeous.
Yeah, they're amazing.
I never knew that either until I read your book, that that the hornworms were actually baby hummingbird moths.
Yeah.
Well, I actually made sure I do the research on that because it would have been really dumb to say that if it wasn't true.
Yeah, they're a unique looking like caterpillar too, you know, like
Yeah.
they're
Right.
that little spiky unicorn horn.
But yeah, that's another point where like aesthetics and beauty and feeling is an important part of the selection process.
Yeah. Well, when I was a market farmer, when I was first starting to develop landrace crops and grow my own varieties, the university conducted a survey of my customers and they said, "Why do you buy Joseph's produce?" And I was thinking, oh, they're going to say because it's organic, because it's locally grown, because I know the farmer. No, it wasn't any of that stuff. It was for the flavor.
Mm.
And that was shocking to me and startling. And it totally changed how I think about my growing and my plant breeding, because I adopted the attitude that I would taste every fruit before I save seeds from it. And if I didn't like the flavor of a fruit, it was cold, it was gone.
Mm-hmm.
And what that did for me was over a few years, my plants became really flavorful and delightful.
Mm.
I really like how you mentioned too that you would ask some of your customers to save seeds for you of the fruit that they really liked as well.
Yes, and that way my plant breeding becomes a community effort.
Yeah.
And it's not just me. I had a chef that I would take him hundreds of squash a year, and he would save seeds from all of them unless he thought the flavor or the color or something, the smell was off. And then he would cull them.
Uh-huh.
And then he'd also give me a little piece of the fruit with the seeds so that I could taste it at home and make sure that, oh, we had a two-step validation process for the flavor.
That's so cool.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I would like to get into more about the community and how important that is in landrace gardening. But first, I think maybe we should define what a landrace is.
So to me, my definition of landrace is a crop that is genetically diverse, cross-pollinating, so that it can undergo survival of the fittest selection to become locally adapted.
Mm-hmm.
And also to me, land races are intimately connected with the community.
Yeah.
And with the location.
Mm-hmm. And so how's that different than like an heirloom, for instance?
So an heirloom, my definition of an heirloom is a variety that was developed far away and long ago.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And has been inbred ever since then.
Right.
And so what happens with the heirlooms is generation after generation, maybe for 50 years, for 100 years, they become inbred over and over and over again. And what the inbreeding does is it causes them to lose genetic diversity. And so heirlooms end up becoming these fragile little varieties that might have been wonderful a long time ago and far away, but they're not really as adapted to local conditions as they could be.
And I guess they also don't have the ability to adapt to new things, new changes either, right?
Right. And they lack that ability because of the lack of genetic diversity. So I have neighbors that have the same growing conditions that I do. They have the same soil, they have the same arid climate, they have the same irrigation water. And they will whine to me that they can't keep their crops alive with everyday irrigation. And how come I only irrigate once a week? And so I talk to them about where they got their seeds, and they'll say, oh, we got these from beautiful organic farm up in Oregon. Damp, wet, humid, overcast constantly. And it's like, And then they come here and it's 5% humidity and the sun shines all day, every day. And it's like, no wonder they don't thrive, because they were adapted to someplace else far away.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of value in the heirlooms if you take 4 or 5 of them, allow them to cross-pollinate with each other, and then select among those for things that can thrive in current conditions in our local farms.
Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this in terms of geese, because we did geese this year, and we got a variety that was more recently from France, but it looks the same as like an American Toulouse goose. But the American Toulouse goose, and there are two kinds. There's the one that has like the big fat pendulums on their necks and so on, and those have like some of the lowest fertility of any domesticated geese, because they've just been inbred over 100 years.
Right.
Whereas these geese that are actually more of a land race that are more recently brought in from France, they lay more eggs than any of the other breeds, and they,
High
fertility rates, because in America people are breeding geese primarily for like 4-H clubs and like showing them instead of for like meat and eggs. But that is so important, that like we have this idea of an heirloom, and it's more of the idea of like this abstract ideal of what it should be than to actually how it does in the local environment.
Right. Well, we use a term often to describe heirlooms. We say they are open pollinated. And that implies, there's some genetic diversity running around and blah, blah, blah. But in actuality, every trick that we know is used to prevent those open pollinated varieties from actually crossing. Even though emotionally we think of open pollinated as, there's going to be diversity and cross pollination.
Yeah.
No.
So when you start a landrace project, you try to bring in lots of different genetics from all over and see what works well where you are.
I've started them in several different ways. Like with the sweet corn project, we brought in 200 varieties and crossed them, and away we went. With the watermelon, we did the same thing. With one of my squash land races, it started with an accidental cross-pollination. And I'm like, it's because I had a green buttercup squash and it got pollinated with something like a red curry. And so all of a sudden I had red colors in my green butternut squash. So I reselected for the flavor I love and some of the red fruits and some of the green fruits.
Cool.
And then a few years later, that got cross-pollinated again with a Hopi white squash. And so that brought more colors in and more diversity. And so that was just a slow, gradual process as compared to some of the intentional crosses.
Cool.
When you're guiding these land races, you are still using a lot of selection criteria, right? You're not just like letting them just go willy-nilly.
So my experience is that about 80% of the selection is happening by the environment.
Right.
I have nothing to do with it. The environment is doing the selection. And then on top of that selection, I'm saving what I love. I'm saving the colors I love, the flavors I love, the growth habits that I love. If a plant just looks really good, I'm going to save seeds from it. And I might plant it separately just to see what it does, or I might plant it, say, on a thing I commonly do is I plant what I think is the best on one end of the row, and then plant the bulk seed further down the row.
That makes sense. So what are some of your favorite, flavors, and like what do you select for, specifically with some of your plants?
So I always love the taste of carotenes in my food.
And so carotene is like the orange color?
Yes, carotene is an orange-colored antioxidant, and the more orange-colored the vegetable is, the more carotenes it has in it, is a rough approximation. And so when I'm selecting for my squash, if I cut a squash open and it's white inside, it's going right in the compost. I don't even have to taste it because I know it's going to be ghastly.
Yeah. Great.
But if it's orange or deep yellow,
Uh-huh.
then it's a candidate for cooking and tasting.
Hmm.
And I've done the same kind of thing with sweet corn and with my musk melons, because to me they just taste better if they're more colorful.
Yeah. And so is that different than like the red color?
So the red colors, there's two different red colors, but the red color in like corn and cabbage is anthocyanins,
Mm-hmm.
and they can taste really good as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there are plant breeders that specifically select for the deepest purple colors
Mm-hmm.
because of that flavor.
Hmm.
And then there's the red color in beets. Let's see, what's that called? Betylene or something like that. I don't know if I particularly like that flavor.
Hmm. So what do you love so much about carotene?
It just makes me happy. and and also the carotenes are a precursor to vitamin A in the body.
Oh.
Okay.
And so I like to have my little fantasy that if I select for higher carotenes in my food, that I'm getting better nutrition as well.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
But that's interesting that like, well, first of all, you have the ability to like listen to your body and feel like like a specific chemical compound makes you happy, you know, like in a food. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Well, I listen to my body also, and I know that green tomatoes must be poisonous.
Ah.
Even if you fry them?
Even if.
Hmm.
But there also, when I pay attention, I think that there's poisons in the like bean seeds,
Uh-huh.
and those poisons are dissipated by cooking, and so I make sure and cook anything beans really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, also the soaking them removes some of the, what are they called?
Lectins? Or?
Lectins, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Boy, after we started doing that, definitely, you know, it seems like I'm absorbing more of the nutrients from beans and like not having as much intestinal distress.
Mm-hmm.
I concur with that. Soaking is a great way to prepare beans, and we have these traditional cooking methods, and they're there for a reason. I mean, people have been paying attention to how foods affect their body for tens of thousands of years. And traditional cooking methods with beans are that you soak them and you cook them for a long time. And so I'm not really inventing anything new when I pay attention to how food makes me feel.
Yeah, totally.
And I guess another one of those things we talk about in the book is with corn, nixtamalization. And this is something that I also do, like when I'm getting tortillas from the store, there's like a couple brands that have lime as an ingredient.
Right.
Most of them don't, but that's a traditional way of processing corn that makes it more bioavailable, right?
Yes, it releases a B vitamin from it, niacin, I think maybe. Also, it eliminates some of the toxins from mold on the seed.
Ah, and so you use like pickling lime for that, but
Yeah, I just get it from the grocery store.
then you can also use just wood ash.
Yes.
Have you ever tried that? Is it good?
I haven't tried the wood ash, because lime is so easy to get at the grocery store.
Yeah, I guess we just also we have a wood stove, so we have a lot of wood ash. you know,
Well,
trying to find things to do with it.
if I was going to do it with wood ash, I would just make sure and use fresh ash,
Uh-huh.
because the carbon dioxide from the air will deactivate it over time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Cool. So there are some other really good important things about land race breeding that makes a lot of sense as far as like, because when you have this genetic diversity, it's good for adapting to your locality, but also I mean that's important for like food security and climate instability. During your years of gardening, have you noticed like climate patterns changing, or do you see this as a way, as a strategy to be able to have food security in such a unstable climate?
So landrace gardening is beautiful for food security because there's so much genetic diversity that the crops can adjust to whatever the climate does.
Yeah.
And like I have some years that are dry years, and some families will do better in those dry years, and the other families will do better in the wet years. But while I'm saving seeds, if I save liberally so that I don't throw away every plant that doesn't do very well this year, then I keep some diversity around so that they can continue to change. Another thing that I do to keep the diversity up is I might introduce a new variety from time to time. Say 5% or 10% of my seed that I plant might be a new variety. If I like it, I save seeds from it. If I don't, it hasn't really affected my regular crop, but it has brought some diversity with it. And I'm not smart enough to predict what diversity is going to be needed in the future. So I just keep as much diversity as makes sense to keep.
Yeah. I'm also interested in is, where did you get the idea for landrace gardening? Because I mean, it's been around for a while, but it's not commonly talked about as far as I'm aware.
So I got the idea from that variety of corn that I grew, my first landrace crop. And traditionally, land races are this evil thing, this unevolved,
Backwards.
things that the hill people do.
Uh-huh.
It's not what sophisticated people do. But in my own experience, the land races are the most sophisticated way to grow. They're the most evolved and wise because of the genetic diversity and their ability to adapt to every local condition, to the farmer's habits even.
Right.
Like not wanting to weed as much or
Uh-huh.
doing certain
Well,
shaped things. Yeah.
like I was evaluating the growing practices of a seed company, and one of the farmers in the seed company was planting his plants over top of plastic. He was covering them with plastic, and his whole growing system was devoted to plastic, plastic, plastic.
Yeah.
And so what he was ending up doing is he was selecting for plants that are adapted to growing on plastic and with plastic and under plastic.
Oh, wow. And
And so,
irrigated by plastic.
yes, he was irrigating with plastic. And so then when they actually got to a gardener that likes growing in the open air, in the dirt, in the soil, if we want to be fancy, then they don't grow because they're missing essential components of their biology.
Yeah. Oh,
And
wow.
and the commercial seed industry did the same thing, because they grow in these fields that are weeded with pesticides, and the crops are protected with pesticides and herbicides, and all of these chemicals are used. And so the plants come to depend on those and forget how to deal with a bug or a weed. And so when they get to a gardener where the farmer doesn't want to poison their crops, the seeds are at a disadvantage because they don't have their normal ecosystem surrounding them.
Right.
Yeah.
Just shows how important selection is and how it's happening all the time, regardless of whether or not you're being conscious about it.
Oh, yes. I'm all the time being startled about a trait that my plants have developed in response to my habits as a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, I did that.
Can you give us an example of some?
Well, one example that really stands out to me is I grow my tomatoes sprawling on the ground.
Same.
So no, I don't trellis them. I don't worry about airflow. I don't worry about dirt splashing on the leaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when I was picking tomatoes for saving seeds, I was only picking clean tomatoes.
Mm-hmm.
Any tomato that was dirty because it was laying in the dirt, I wasn't picking. And
Mm-hmm.
what that ended up doing for me is my tomato vines took on an architecture where they were these little arcs.
Cool.
And the tomatoes would stay up on the arches. And it's like, oh yeah, that habit.
Yes. That's amazing.
And you do that with corn too?
Yes, I was more deliberate with it on the corn because I have some fields where there's coons and skunks, and I have some fields where there's not. And one year I moved my sweet corn patch and grew it in the field that has the skunks and the coons, and they took out most of my crop.
Mm.
But I allowed it because I like to live in harmony with the ecosystem. But I saved the seeds from that crop and replanted. And after about 3 years, the coons and the skunks weren't taking my corn anymore because the stalks on the corn had got really robust, and the cobs had went from being about 3 feet off the ground to being about 5 feet off the ground.
Oh, wow.
And
Right.
and the animals are kind of lazy. They just want to go and push a corn stalk over and eat it.
Mm.
The corn became strong enough that they couldn't just easily push it over, and they would have had to climb up the stalk or whatever. And it's like, heck with this.
Yeah. Wow.
And so that was a more intentional selection for resistance to those mammals.
Yeah.
And we were talking about beans earlier, and I actually wanted to ask you, like, what do you select for in beans, and what type of beans do you like to grow?
So I like to grow bush beans
Uh-huh.
because I don't want to put poles in my garden because that's labor.
Yeah.
It's labor to put them in. It's labor to take them down. It's labor to harvest them one pod at a time. Where when I grow bush beans, at harvest time, I'll yank the whole plant up, throw it on a tarp, jump up and down on it, and then I have my harvest.
Love that.
There's another bean trait that I really like, which I call semi-vining, because they have vines that are larger than, or they grow larger than the bush beans, but they don't really climb up anything. They just sort of sprawl around. And I don't call against that trait when I see it because they tend to be really productive beans. But I grow my beans all jumbled up together. So I might have 1,000 varieties of beans on my farm, and I can identify about 100 of them as being distinctly different. And whatever is the most productive tends to produce the most seeds. And so I don't mind at all doing the bulk planting and the bulk harvest of a whole bunch of different varieties.
But so beans, they're not as easy to do like the landrace and the outcrossing thing with, right?
Correct. On my farm, beans are outcrossing at about a 1% rate.
Okay.
On some farms, they might produce as much as 5% outcrossing. So one of my habits is to watch for those naturally occurring hybrids
Mm-hmm.
and plant them in larger quantities the next year. What that ends up doing is my beans are becoming locally adapted, but it's a lot slower than with a cross-pollinating crop like corn.
Right. Right.
Because the more often you can have a cross-pollination event, the more it's like running a lottery. The more crosses you have, the more chances you have to win the lottery.
Mm.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what are some of the other plants that are harder to do this with?
There's some plants that we grow by cloning.
Yeah.
Garlic and potatoes, they have been grown by cloning for so long and have accumulated so much chromosome damage during that time that they have basically forgotten how to produce seeds. And so with garlic, some plant explorers went to the Tian Shan Mountains over in like Uzbekistan and actually found some wild garlic that could still cross-pollinate. And so we're working on developing new varieties of garlic by working with those strains.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess a lot of those plants like potatoes, any tubers or bulbs are just really hard.
Right. People used to tell me when I first started doing this that Jerusalem artichokes are sterile and they don't make seeds. But what actually is going on is they can't make seeds with themselves. And so if you have a whole garden that's all a clone of one plant, it's not going to make seeds.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But if you get 3 or 4 varieties, then they'll make seeds and you can plant those seeds and get new varieties.
Okay, folks, we've reached the halfway point of episode 58 with Joseph, so please check out the second half at our Patreon, which is patreon.com/plantcunning. And again, if you're interested in herbal products, you can see my website at travelingherbfarmer.com. And if you're interested in buying seeds or buying Joseph's book, Landrace Gardening, you can go to his website, which is lofthouse.com, LOFTHOUSE.com. Thanks for listening. We wish you all the best.